Hi there, this is part of a series of short topic videos for A2 Macro looking at barriers to growth and economic development for emerging frontier economies. And in this short session, we're going to take a look at primary product dependence. So many developing countries have a very high dependence on extracting and exporting primary commodities. They might well be rich in natural resources, and the share of those resources in total GDP, in employment and in exports, for example, can often be extremely high. However, what this means is that these countries are especially vulnerable to changing volatile global prices. And there are also big risks if countries over-specialise in the products in which they have this advantage, their natural resource advantage, particularly if the terms of trade from their key exports deteriorate. Resource-rich countries, or sometimes called factor-driven input countries, may suffer from what's called the natural resource curse, which can include the Dutch disease effect. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Countries that are heavily dependent on natural resources rely on extractive rents from resources under the ground, but this can often fuel high levels of corruption, inequalities of income and wealth, and also wasteful consumption as natural resources are fast depleted. High commodity prices can cause the currency to appreciate, and this is what we mean by the Dutch disease. So an increase in the value of a primary commodity can cause an increase in export sales. That pushes up the exchange rate, but can make emerging manufacturing sectors in that host economy less competitive, and may indeed lead to deindustrialization before a country is actually fully developed. Oftentimes the revenues from natural resources are not used productively to diversify the economy and also to feed through directly to people and communities to improve HDI, Human Development Index outcomes, for example, better education and healthcare. The result is that many countries who are blessed with strong endowment of natural resources can end up perhaps having a slower rate of growth and poorer development scores. And this is known as the natural resource curse. Here's an interesting chart showing primary product dependence for a selection of sub-Saharan African countries. And you can see that Angola is right up there in terms of a country that's almost entirely dependent on fuel, oil, as a major source of exports. Likewise for countries such as Nigeria and Chad. Ethiopia is also highly primary dependent. Over 80% of exports come from primary commodities, but in Ethiopia's case it's food which is the major primary export. Likewise with a very poor country such as Malawi. Kenya is an interesting country. It's increasingly making its manufacturing a key part of their growth and development story. But even Kenya still has over 50% of exports coming from the primary sector, including food. So we mentioned Malawi. Malawi has a very low level of economic complexity and a very low level of economic diversity. Over 45% of their exports of goods come from raw tobacco, 5% from raw sugar, just over 6% from tea, because Malawi is highly dependent on mining and extractive products. Less than 10% of their exports come from the manufacturing sector. So we've mentioned the idea of the natural resource curse. The natural resource curse, or the natural resource trap, is where countries that have a very high natural endowment of factors of production actually end up with slower growth and worse development outcomes. Notice this quote here from the renowned development economist Sir Paul Collier. Although large deposits of key resources, such as oil, would normally be considered a blessing for the human development prospects of a country, it often turns out to be a resource curse. And likewise, some research by the IMF has also produced a similar outcome. Resource-rich countries tend to perform more poorly on the Human Development Index than do non-resource rich countries. Interesting quote there from the IMF Finance and Development blog. The fundamental goal of resource-rich countries should be to transform their exhaustible, in other words finite, natural resources into assets, human, domestic and private capital and foreign financial assets. Those assets will generate future income and support sustained development, but the record is mixed. Zambia is another case of a country which is highly export dependent, in particular on refined and raw copper, 69% of exports, and cobalt, 2% of exports. Very, very high level of primary export dependency. Their Major export industry is copper. They're not the biggest copper producer in the world, that's Chile. But in most cases, Zambian copper producers basically take the prevailing world price. And as you can see, the price of copper, the benchmark price in dollars per tonne, has been extremely volatile over the last 10-15 years. Rising prices during the early part of the last decade, but in recent times the price of copper has more than halved. Now Zambia, of course, is primary product dependent. It's dependent on copper. And we've seen in the last few years, let's go back to the chart, a significant fall in the world's price of copper. So what does that do to the Zambian economy? Well, first of all, it causes a direct fall in the value of their copper exports. And of course, AD, aggregate demand, is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So a fall in export revenues brings down aggregate demand and has a direct effect, a negative consequence for Zambian GDP growth. Indeed, Zambia, which until recently was running a balance of payments current account surplus because of the high value of their copper exports, is now running a current account deficit, and that's causing a drain in their foreign exchange reserves. The fall in the price of copper and Zambian exports of copper has caused their currency, their kwacha, to depreciate very sharply. Indeed, it's fallen by more than 50% in the last 2 years, and that in turn has led to higher prices for imports, causing Zambian inflation to rise well above 10%. The falling price of copper, which we can go back to, there you see it. The falling price of copper is also causing job losses in mining, and that brings about increased cyclical unemployment and also structural unemployment if the skills of people working in the copper mining sector can't be translated and transferred to other sectors. And the decline in copper mining is going to have negative multiple effects for supply chain businesses, including housing, retailing and logistics companies. The Zambian government is also highly dependent on profits from the mining industry for their tax revenues. And so therefore the fall in profitability of mining, many are now loss-making, is causing an increased budget deficit for Zambia and a rising level of national debt. Indeed, they may need some IMF support. And there are also social consequences. Many mining companies, transnational corporations, have used the profits they've used from mining to help subsidise antiviral medicines for people suffering from HIV, and that might come under threat in recent times. So, a country such as Zambia, highly primary product dependent on copper, fine when the copper price is going up, although that can drive the exchange rate higher. Not so good when the price of copper is collapsing, as it is at the moment. Finally, what can countries do to help overcome or reduce their primary product dependency? Firstly, they need better government. You need a situation where it's more transparent and more clear where the revenues from extractive resources are going. Taxpayers need to know whether the money from mining and from farming and from oil and gas production is how it's being used and whether it's affecting people's real lives. Secondly, some countries that are rich in natural resources have established either stabilisation funds, which act as a kind of buffer stock. So Ghana now has a stabilisation fund, and when the price of cocoa, for example, goes down, Ghana is able to inject some extra money into the economy to stabilise the level of aggregate demand and jobs. Other countries have built up sovereign wealth funds. So this is an increase in, they use the export revenues to build up a stock of dollars and yen and euros and Chinese yuan. And that money can then be reinvested either in the domestic economy to increase the scale of other industries, or it can be used to invest overseas to provide a flow of income for when the revenues from natural resources slow down. Key issue, of course, is to tax natural resources sufficiently, appropriately, so that the extractive resource rents actually flow back to the government, and that can be invested in health, education, transport, power infrastructure, etc. And crucially, and finally, to overcome primary sector dependency, countries do need to diversify. They need to move away from pure extraction into processing, because processing copper and processing cocoa and coffee beans adds more value than simply growing and extracting the natural resources. Diversification might also involve moving into light manufacturing to add more value, or growing alternative industries such as tourism. Again, they potentially have more higher value added, they might increase GDP per capita, and crucially, a country that's diversified is less susceptible to, less vulnerable to external shocks, volatile global prices. So primary product dependence and the natural resource trap are two significant aspects that are barriers potentially to growth and development, particularly in a number of lower and middle income countries.